welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you're new. It is the end of 2020, which has been pretty much the craziest year that ever was. However, in this video I am going to throw to one side the reality of 2020 and just concentrate on books, which is pretty much the way that I have dealt with the entire year anyway. I read 56 books this year, which I'm pretty happy with. I aim for one a week, so I'm slightly over my target. Looking back at the year in review, I've pulled out some books that really stood out for me. I've split them into different categories, so without further ado, let's get into it. My first category is Dependable Delights. These are books which, to be honest, I knew going into them I was probably gonna love, and I was not let down. And these are books where either the author or the publisher falls into a category which, for me, allows me to just wholeheartedly recommend everything that they have written or everything that they have published, regardless of the fact that I haven't yet read all of it myself, because I just feel like these are really dependable, safe, and always lovely. The first of these is a kind of runner-up book, and this was Theatre Shoes by Noel Streatfeild. So Noel Streatfeild famously wrote the children's book Ballet Shoes, but she also wrote a number of other books in the Shoes series. It has a very similar style of plot to Ballet Shoes, not surprisingly, but I do not hold that against it at all. Streatfeild writes with this deep and sensitive understanding of the psychology of a child and of what it feels like to be a child in such a way that she kind of speaks to the child that was you when you read her work as an adult. For example, there's a scene right at the beginning of this book where one of the children is upset on the train and they get given something to eat, and she just makes a comment about how they actually weren't hungry and the food itself didn't cheer them up at all, but they were grateful for something to do in order to feel less embarrassed whilst being publicly upset. And I just think that kind of sensitive understanding of the depth of sorrow and of struggles as a child is really there in Streatfeild's work. Her stories are enjoyable, her characters are lovely, and the writing just has that perceptive depth that makes her works a classic. So I enjoyed that, and I look forward to exploring more of Noel Streatfeild's works. I still have a lot to get through and I'm excited for all of them. I'm pretty confident they will be dependably delightful. Next, and a super obvious dependably delightful pick, is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which I read very recently. Dickens is just always funny. His writing is dependably rich and luxuriously descriptive, whilst at the same time really tight on plot. His writing just teems with these fantastic characters. All of his works are obviously classics, but I think after my reread of A Christmas Carol, it really stands up there amongst the very best of his works for me, and I genuinely believe that if everybody read this every year at Christmas time, then the world would be a kinder, a more generous and happier place. Everything good that Christmas spirit stands for is summed up in this book. Love, generosity, family, joy, they're all there. Fantastic read. So Dickens in general, represented by A Christmas Carol. A brief mention for The Fortnight in September by R.C. Sheriff. This is a Persephone book and I very much enjoyed it, but I also just want to highlight Persephone books in general. They're the only publisher I know where I can quite readily recommend any works that are published by them. I've read quite a few, I've literally never been disappointed. They focus on neglected, mostly women writers from the 20th century, and the books are always beautifully written but never too heavy, warm, uplifting and life-affirming. Lastly, my most dependable delight is an author who has really become cemented in my heart this year, and that is Eva Ibbotson, and the book that I read by her this year that totally cemented her as a dependable author who I adore was The Morning Gift. So I actually read my first Eva Ibbotson when I was a teenager. I read A Company of Swans, which I enjoyed, but for some reason I never read the rest of her works. I didn't think I was really aware that she'd written that much other stuff. I don't know why I didn't read it all, and I just wish that I had read it all as a teenager, because it was exactly the kind of writing that I was really craving and searching for and felt like I lacked. So anyway, I rediscovered her when a couple of years back I read Journey to the River Sea, which is just a masterpiece. If you haven't read Journey to the River Sea, go and read it now. It's one of the best books I've ever read, a perfect example of children's literature. However, this year I read The Morning Gift, which is one of her books for adults. It's still got a lot of those kind of children's lit vibes, which I adore. She just throws together all of my favourite themes and settings into each and every one of her books, but particularly The Morning Gift. She always has protagonists who are passionate about the arts, about ballet, music, science even, about learning and education. They're hardworking, they have a deep enthusiasm for life itself. In this novel we get the settings of Vienna, of London, of the northeast of England, which I particularly loved because it's a part of the country that is really close to my heart. It's where I went on all my childhood holidays and it's where I went to university. Besides which, I just think it's one of the most beautiful landscapes in the UK. She combines this with a good amount of train travel, a healthy helping of romance, and perceptive, sensitive writing, great dialogue, great side characters. There's a completeness to her works which a lot of similar stories lack, and so she makes what is effectively just a super enjoyable quick comfort read feel like something fuller. So that was the first delightful category. Now we move on to this category is the sticky but sort of sad stories. These are the stories I read which really were good, but I don't feel I can apply the term delight to them because they do not spark joy, they do not fall into the comfort reading category. These are the stories that clung to me like burrs and dug their little spines into my skin. And some of them I read quite early on this year, but they've just really stuck with me. They're all powerful and, I believe, important reads. The first of these stories is Congo Inc. by Nkoli Jean Bafani. This is one I read quite recently. I talked about it in my November wrap-up, but in summary, this is a book which is a fictional exploration of modern DR Congo and of the effect that vicious globalization and greed for natural resources has had on the environment in Congo and has and continues to have on the lives of the people who live there. From child prostitutes to warlords, to church leaders, to tribal groups, to villagers affected by the horrific violence. This was a deeply disturbing and traumatic read. I wasn't personally a huge fan of the writing style, but I nonetheless feel that it's a super important book. It's available in translation. It was simultaneously informative and inventive, and I think is a very worthwhile read. Another runner-up for me in the sticky stories category is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, and it is the story of a girl who has an affair with her English teacher while she is at high school. I found it incredibly powerful and also really interesting because it was a take on child abuse that I haven't seen explored before, which was kind of twofold. One was the way that it looked at how the victims of child sexual abuse don't necessarily recognize themselves as victims, and the way that Vanessa in the story needed to believe her own tale that this was not abuse but rather a tragic love story. Secondly, it looked at the repercussions of abuse throughout somebody's life and kind of shows just what a long-term effect on her potential and on her development this abusive, though she doesn't recognize it as abusive, relationship has. It also looked really sensitively at how press outings of paedophiles affect the victims and are deeply traumatic and challenging for them. So it was a really fascinating book. I read it in 1 or 2 sittings, even though it was quite long. I couldn't put it down. Definitely a book that is worth reading and that stuck with me. My absolute winner of this sad but sticky category, however, is The Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Paterson. This is a book which I believe is a real classic and super famous in the US, but is not particularly well known in the UK. There's a real difference between children's middle grade YA books which are successful in the US and in the UK, I find, and this is definitely one of them. So I went into Bridge to Terabithia not knowing anything about the story except that it was a middle grade classic, and I'm not going to reveal really anything about the plotline because I think it was instrumental in my experiencing the book completely with my whole soul that I didn't know the story before I went into it. But I will say just wow. This book swept me away and tapped into the deepest, tenderest part of my soul and left its mark there. This is an extremely powerful and poignant book. I was surprised that it was middle grade because I'm not sure that I would have enjoyed it at that age, but as an adult I was astounded by it. Okay, on to my very last category, and I have saved the best till last. This is the category of life-enhancing reads. And I have selected these books because they have a twofold purpose. On the one hand, they are an absolute joy just to read in and of themselves, but beyond that, they also give you a kind of moral and spiritual boost of joy and inspiration, which I think carries these stories with you beyond the moment when you close the page, and also for me meant that these were stories that were constantly playing on my mind and making me want to be a better person and making me see the world through more beautiful eyes than my own during the time that I was reading them. The first of these books I'm going to quickly skim over because it's sort of a cheat. It was a reread, and this is just my favourite self-help book that I don't think I've spoken about yet on this channel, but I'm sure I will come back to at some point. That is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey. Yes, I know it has an awful title and it also has a terrible cover. It looks like it's been self-published, but it's actually a really wonderful book that I feel gets at the core of what it means to be a good human being. Covey basically argues that the most important thing for your own personal happiness is to be a person of character who lives their life dependably by a strong set of values that are based on fundamental beliefs of honesty, of decency, of kindness, etc. It's written in a very simple yet uplifting and inspiring way. I genuinely really like all the little anecdotes that he tells in this book. I find them illuminating, I find them relatable to the real challenges of human life. This book doesn't skim over the fact that life is hard and sometimes almost impossibly hard, but it just shows multiple ways that you can survive that hardship and that you can live life as a person who you are proud to be. I read this book every year. I've now read it for the last 3 years. I'm already excited to read it again next year because I feel like I still have so much to learn and so much growth to do, and I know that this is a book that I probably will read every year for the rest of my life because you never cease striving to be the best version of yourself. This book makes being that best version of yourself seem attainable and reminds you why it's worth doing. Next, another November read that I ranted about. This is Under a Dancing Star by Laura Wood. This is a YA retelling of Much Ado About Nothing, but it just fills you with so much joie de vivre and a drive to do the things and to make the space in your life for what you are passionate about. It's a wonderful reminder of the importance of surrounding yourself by people who build you up, who support you, who support your dreams, encourage them and believe in you. It's also a reminder of the fact, and this is something that I feel isn't discussed often enough, doing what you love with your life isn't selfish. It makes you somebody who is a better person for everybody else to be around because you end up being a light who gives joy, who gives enthusiasm, who gives encouragement, rather than if you trap yourself in the life that perhaps somebody else wants for you or that you feel you're expected to live. This book shows that in wonderful, uplifting, joyous writing, and I really adored it. I can't wait to read her other books. Lastly, I've saved the best till last. I think this was possibly my favourite book of the year. It's hard to say for certain. There's actually even some other books that I haven't even mentioned on this video that didn't directly fall into any of my categories, but that I kind of feel sad for not having mentioned. I'm quickly going to flash them up. They're The Colour Purple and War and Peace. War and Peace because I'm really proud that I read it and I also actually really enjoyed it. And Colour Purple I talked about in a wrap-up video, but phenomenal book. However, I do think my favourite book of this year was A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. This book was just so up my street. It reminded me of a kind of adult retelling of The Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which is my favourite children's book. It follows the story of a Russian count who gets placed under house arrest by the communists due to his aristocratic status, and his house arrest takes place in a grand hotel in Moscow. He is trapped in this hotel, he cannot leave, and he goes from being a man of extremely high standing, obviously an aristocrat who would have attended that hotel as a guest of honour, to being a member of the staff at the hotel. Very similar to Sarakru in Little Princess in a way. And again, similarly, he is a man of spirit, of endurance, of impeccable politeness, of consistent interest in others, and also of deep, deep kindness. He is somebody who is creative, who makes joy for himself and others when there is very little around to make that joy out of. And he was just an utter inspiration of a character. I adored him. Every other line in the novel I was underlining as something that I wanted to remember. It was such a wonderful novel. I almost found it painful how much I didn't want it to end. And I think one of the greatest joys of it for me is that the Count has been a sort of Anne Shirley-esque takeaway character who I hold in my heart and who can and has genuinely helped me to get through tough times in my life, because I sort of think to myself, put on the glasses of this character, put Anne's eyes over your own, put the Count's eyes over your own. How can you see this situation in their light rather than getting stuck in my own miserable self sometimes? He gave me a perspective which enabled me to see the world with eyes brighter than my own. On top of that, it's just a really fascinating way to look at modern-ish Russian history and to kind of reflect on how full a life can be, even when it's lived very quietly, even when it's lived in literally one place without moving. So that was a wonderful novel, my favourite novel, I think, and the one that I'm going to end this video on. I have had so much fun reading this last year. I have absolutely adored making these videos about the books that I've read and engaging with them, reflecting on them more deeply than I have done my reads in recent years. I very much hope you've enjoyed watching this video. I hope it gives you some ideas from some books that you might want to read yourself in 2021. Thank you so very much for watching. I will see you in the next video, and Happy New Year!